everybody. It's your old pal, the Moo Cow here, back with an utter short review Thursday. And this time, I will be checking out a movie from 2013 called Revelation Trail. So, Revelation Trail is kind of a mashup movie. It's kind of a horror movie, but it's also a Western. So it's like a zombie movie set in a Western, or I guess it's more accurate to say it's a Western starring zombies. So it's kind of like, Walking Dead meets the Old West. Except it's not really set in the Old West, the traditional Old West. But basically what you've got going on, it's the late 1880s, and for some reason, there are zombies starting to go a-munchin', and when they do, they go after this preacher and his nice family, and they get et, and he's on the run. He goes into town, and that's when he meets his soon-to-be buddy, U.S. Marshal Edwards, and the two of them have to beat feet because the whole town is turning into zombie food. So, they find out the usual zombie tropes. You have to shoot them in the head. You don't want to get bit. All that kind of normal stuff that you would see in your standard zombie film. Except, it's in the West, and they're on horses, and they're using six guns and muskets and stuff like that. So they have to get out of Dodge, except it's not Dodge. But anyway, they have to leave, and they end up traveling around for a bit, just kind of killing zombies and being sort of ponderously philosophical from time to time. During this period, you sort of get an idea of what Preacher Guy is like and what Marshall Guy is like, and how they're both very, very different people, and they're sort of reacting to this strange, horrific, and new world in very, very different ways. And in a lot of ways, that makes the movie kind of more of a character study, or at least it evolves into something of a character study for like the middle part. And then towards the last third, these guys end up bumping into or taken hostage by a group of guys who are living in a makeshift fort that I guess was a previous Civil War fort, which it's kind of weird. I mean, it looks pretty, tattered and old and lackadaisical, and it would be, you would think, because wooden forts don't last from 1860s to 1880s generally in good condition, unless you're upkeeping them a whole lot of time. So yeah, they're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. But anyway, they go back, and they find out that the leader of the fort is some guy by the name of Sam Beard, and I'm not exactly sure what he did previously. They kind of hint that he was either a miner or some kind of scalawag, but now he's become leader of this fort, and in order to make sure that people understand that he's a leader, he's wearing a Confederate uniform, and he makes a big deal about how the uniform never ceases to impress people. So, and I guess it would. So this is the late 19th century after the Civil War, so I'm guessing there are still people who remember it and have feelings about it. And he's kind of a bully, and he decides that everybody inside has to stay there, and whoever does, you can't show any signs of being bitten or they'll throw you out. You have to fight or else they'll throw you out, all that kind of stuff, which kind of makes a little bit of sense. You just kind of don't have to be an asshole about it. But he is, and that's kind of the problem. And also, like I said, the fort is pretty ramshackle. It doesn't look particularly safe, and they're kind of mean to the people who are there. So the preacher and the marshal are kind of like, well, let's just get the hell out of here. And of course, that ends up leading into problems. And because the Sam Beard doesn't really want them to go anywhere, but the marshal makes the preacher leave, and he stays behind to cause a distraction, and his distraction is basically killing Sam Beard. But you're not really sure what happens to his character after that. You get the impression he's not gonna make it. Meanwhile, the preacher sort of runs off and is killing zombies as he goes, and he eventually makes his way to this other town, Something Hope, that they were trying to get to in the first place when Sam Beard was like, yeah, that place got scratched. Don't worry about it. And then he's there with some chick and some Native American guy, and then a whole new horde of zombies show up, and they are shown fighting them off, and that's kind of it. Um, so this was an interesting film. It's definitely a low budget or micro budget indie film. Supposedly the budget for this movie was only $34,000, which, that's peanuts these days. Um, they were they had to resort to building some of their own sets, in particular the fort, because apparently they were going to film it at a place called Fort Massac in Illinois, and that's kind of like a period reproduction fort. But in the summer of 2011, that site got flooded out, and they were unable to use it. So apparently there was enough old dilapidated barns that got destroyed by the flood that they were able to repurpose them and build a set out of those parts, which is pretty flappin' cool if you ask me. And they were on Kickstarter for a while because they ended up breaking up sort of part of the film. Half the film was shot during the summer, and then they had to go on to Kickstarter, get some funds, build their set, and then in the winter they were able to go back after the set was built and then shoot the rest of the film. And this is the sort of thing you have to do when you're an independent production group, and you don't have the backing of Hollywood of any way, shape, or form. You have to sort of come up with your own stuff. And apparently a lot of the clothing wasn't particularly period, but they kind of made it or disguised it to look that way because they would get rid of things like plastic buttons and replace them with wooden ones or metal ones to make it look good. And there's a story about how one of the actors, Daniel Van Thomas, who plays the preacher, they couldn't really afford to buy real leather boots for him, so he ended up getting these vinyl pretend leather boots, pleather boots, from like a male stripper catalog online. He had to wear them, which is kind of humorous if you ask me. Just going to adjust this a little bit. And that's what you do. You make do with what you've got. And, I didn't notice. I mean, I'm not going to look at the guy's boots. I mean, I did notice a few details, and I guess we could talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But I did want to talk a little bit about the folks who ended up making the film. It's produced, written, and directed by a guy named John P. Gibbon. And, from what I've gone online and found out, I mean, this is pretty much it. He's produced a number of projects, but he hasn't really directed much else or written much else, maybe the occasional short. But this has been his main effort so far, and it wasn't bad. I mean, from a directing point of view, it was actually pretty good. The writing has some issues. Some of the plot I have some problems with. But overall, for a first film and for an indie film, for $34K and have it look as good as it did, please, that was really, really well done in my opinion. And then the cast. So the main guy is named, he's just called the Preacher. I don't think he's ever given a proper name. And like I said, he's played by Daniel Van Thomas, who is also one of the writers in the project as well. He was in some stuff called, The Exorcist Files. He was in a movie called Alien Rising. He was in something called Soul Hunter. And apparently he is also a voice actor who is in a number of the Ultraman remakes. So that's kind of interesting. Ultraman X. I don't know how different that is from the traditional old Ultraman. I don't know much about it, but there you go. So the next most important guy would be Marshall Edwards. He's played by Daniel Britt, who's an older guy who's really, really does a good job with this. Turns out he hasn't been as many things as I would have expected. Excuse me. He was in a movie called The Preacher's Mind and The Old Man and the Gun, and he was in something called The Healing Camp, which I think is just put out in 2020. So I'm kind of surprised that he kind of comes across as more of a veteran presence, and he's actually quite good. And then the guy who plays Sam Beard is named Robert Valentine. Another surprise, he was also quite good, kind of gave his character a very Irish kind of lilt, and, makes him seem pretty slimy and pretty, despicable and pretty crazy without actually going nuts and actually physically killing anyone. But he did a very good job. But this was his only film credit, so he seems to have done pretty well. I thought he did a good job. And then finally, a lady by the name of Jordan Elizabeth plays Elizabeth, the preacher's wife, who ends up getting et, unfortunately. It's kind of weird initially when you first run into the characters, because she looks so young. I kind of assumed that she was his daughter. So when they started like canoodling, I was like, the hell's going on here? Because he also has a son, Robert, and the son looks to be about 8 or 10, and Isabel looks to be like 16, 17. So I'm like, wait a second, how does that work out? But I guess she's older. She just looks young, which, good thing for Jordan Elizabeth. She has been in a number of things. She is the writer and star of a movie I have called Black Widows, which is actually pretty interesting. That's from 2016. She's also in something called Sunday Night Slaughter. And then she's done a few shorts and a few other things. So she's been around a little bit, but be very curious to see some more stuff. But she looked very different in this film than she looked in Black Widows, which is kind of interesting. She doesn't look quite as young. I don't know whether it was just the costume that made her look so young, but I could have sworn she was like 17, 18 years old, which, I don't know. Good for you, Jordan. So, like I said, there were a few things that I had about the film that I had a little problems with. Part of it's the setting. This is not your typical Old West because it's not set out in the Old West. So when you think the Old West, you're thinking like Arizona, New Mexico, or Texas or something like that, some dusty area like that. No dust, no deserts, nothing like that. It's actually very green and lots of trees. So it's sort of like the Far East. You know what I mean? Kind of like that no man's land between the Old West and the settled East, which would have been something like the western part of Missouri or Kansas or something like that, which would have been fine if it had been set just after the Civil War. But since this is the late 1880s, it kind of feels out of place. It's set about 20 or 25 years too late, especially with some of the costumes and some of the guns. And, by then, they didn't really have marshals running around out there, just, doing law and order, so much as they had them in the territories. And they didn't have territories there. There was an Indian territory nearby, but that's not where this is. They don't really say where this place is set, and that's probably a good idea because it doesn't really fit in the historical West, at least in the way that we see it. But that's okay. I think they made do the best they could with what they had, and it still looks pretty darn good. There's some CGI stuff going on there, mixed in with some practical effects that are decent. Some of it works, some of it kind of doesn't. And the movie gets a little ponderous, especially in the middle, where the characters are like kind of philosophizing a lot about stuff that's going on. At one point, Preacher finds this dead guy who's dragged his ass across the ground in a bear trap. And funny enough, it turns out the guy who plays the corpse is actually, or the reanimated corpse is actually the writer and director John P. Gibson. So that's kind of fun. And for about 5 minutes, we get to hear the preacher kind of philosophizing about stuff and what does this mean and blah blah blah. And we could have used a minute, maybe. We didn't really need 5 minutes, but that's kind of an example of how things get sort of soft around the middle. So the beginning is got a lot going on. The end has a lot going on. In some of the end, it's kind of weird, like when the zombies, and they don't use the word zombies, by the way, which is interesting. I'll get back to that. But when the zombies do finally attack the fort, there isn't much of a defense. They don't really do much. It's pretty easy for them to get in, and some of them don't even bother to defend themselves. There's a couple of musicians who just play and then just keep playing even as the zombies are sort of killing them and eating them. It's just kind of weird, like the band plays on as the ship goes down. That's interesting, but I'm thinking in real life people would have fucking done something about themselves, like escape. So that was kind of weird. And I've seen online where there have been some people talking about the inconsistency with the zombies or the reanimated dead or whatever you want to call them. I didn't really have a problem with that. And you know, I guess at this time they would not have had a word for zombies. They wouldn't have they wouldn't have said undead either. I'm not sure what they would have come up with. But I think in the film they were referring to them in different names. They were at one point they said that there were lurkers, there were runners, there were wanderers, and it seems like you had different zombies going about at different speeds, which seems to make sense to me. I mean, why should all zombies be the same? Why should they all be ponderous and slow or all be extremely fast? Why wouldn't you have a variety of different zombies? Because you'd think corpses are going to be at different stages of decay, and not all of them are going to be able to, you know, maneuver around on their, you know, dead muscles that no longer have oxygen and can support their bodies. So yeah, okay, so it's a ridiculous concept scientifically, but go with it here. It's okay, in my opinion, to have different kinds of zombies and not worry about it being inconsistent. I had more issues with some of the inconsistencies in the actual plot itself, but for the most part, it's kind of a small nitpick. Overall, Revelation Trail's kind of a nice little film. It's interesting. It's different than what you've seen before as far as zombie films. There are a couple of other zombie Western mashups out there. I'd say this one, considering it's such a small budget, it stacks up just as well as any of them. So, again, this is yet another dollar store find that I had at the Dollar Tree for $1. Come on, you can't beat that. So that's really cool. I would say go out and definitely go ahead and pick up Revelation Trail. I think you'll enjoy it. Another one, would I spend $15 for it? You know, I don't know. I might. You know, in the spirit of helping independent cinema, I might go ahead and do that. Just because it would be nice to see more from John P. Gibson. I don't know that he's done really much of anything since 2013. Let's hope he has something else cooking. And let's hope that he gets a chance to show us all more of his talent. And hopefully some of the other folks who are involved will also get involved as well. I can tell you that this particular DVD does come with a bunch of extras at the end. There's some feature stuff, there's some what if, or making ofs, and some, I think there's commentary by the writer and the main actor. So there's extra stuff that's on there. So, you know, come on, for $1, it's a great bargain. Heck, even if you pay for the full price, go ahead and do it, because you're supporting independent cinema, and we're all about that. So once again, thanks yet again for coming on by to short film reviews Thursdays here at Indie Film Cafe. I'm your old pal, the Moo Cow, once again, and we will see you on the flip side. Bye.